look, you talk about the election not being free and fair. It's not going to return Myanmar to democracy. That's a different question from does it bring a greater degree of stability for economic activity? And it might, very well might do that.
Hello, and welcome to episode 57 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, December 12, and today we're getting a national economic update from friend of the show, Jared Bissinger, at a time when the military's so-called elections are just around the corner. But before we hear that, allow me to cover two of the major developments in Myanmar this week. I'll cover the elections and conflict. There have been several updates in the scam industry as well, concerning the military regime, Thailand, the Karen National Union, and the stalemate at Minlepan village, but I'm going to leave all that out today and encourage you instead to first subscribe to Frontier's Daily Briefing newsletter, which details the daily news, and second, to visit the websites of the many excellent Myanmar daily news operations that forensically follow the scam industry closely. These outlets are still reorganising and struggling with constrained resources and would really benefit from your visit and attention. Now, on with the show. So first up, as the military advanced further north in Mandalay region and fended off resistance attacks in Mogok this week, it also unleashed terrifying atrocities on civilians around the country. Last Friday, the military bombed several villages in resistance-controlled areas of Debayin Township. In one strike on a tea shop, the pilot killed at least 19 people, including a 4-year-old, and injured 30 others. A resident there told media outlet The Democratic Voice of Burma that there was no fighting or conflict in the area at the time. And then on Wednesday, which was also International Human Rights Day, by the way, the military bombed a hospital in Arakan Army-controlled Mrau town in Rakhine State. That strike killed at least 31 people and wounded over 68, with the death toll expected to increase as the patients succumb to their wounds. Healthcare capacity is already low in Rakhine State, which is blockaded by the Myanmar military and in the depths of an economic crisis as the Arakan Army continues to fight for control of the entire state. So the military has only increased its airstrikes year on year since its disastrous coup in 2021, and these recent attacks show that it has no sign of slowing this down, even this month, the month of its so-called elections that it touts will lead to a new civilian government. On first count, adding up the media reports this week, since last Friday, at least 68 civilians have been killed by the Myanmar military in Chopengalt, Pakant, Mongmate, and the aforementioned Dabayin and Mrau townships. At least 2 children are among the dead, and over 100 people have been injured this week, many seriously. These attacks were carried out from the sky by jet, by gyrocopter, paramotor, and with drones. And second, people in cities and towns across Myanmar held a silent strike on Wednesday in opposition to the military's planned elections starting on December 28. Exile media outlet The Democratic Voice of Burma reported that the military ordered officials in Yangon to increase security on the day and to create crowds to thwart the strike's potential effect. But the strike did seem to have some success, with many quieter roads and shopping precincts photographed by freelancers and citizen journalists across towns and cities in Myanmar. But it's fair to say that the dramatic and poignant portraits of the empty streetscapes from earlier silent strikes after the coup were absent this time. And on the international side, this week a high-level delegation from Thailand, led by Thai Foreign Minister Sihasak Phuongketkeow, sat down with coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and other military regime officials in Nay Pyi Taw on last Sunday. And on top of talking about combating the scam industry and other things, apparently Sihasak expressed his desire that the military's upcoming planned elections will be just one part of a political transition and a broader peace process. Remember, last month, Ishak said in Bangkok that these elections won't be free or fair. So in this way, he echoed what this podcast's guests and other Myanmar and foreign analysts, civil society, and the anti-coup resistance movement, the Spring Revolution in general, what they've all been saying for months. However, Ishak did add in Bangkok that the elections could still be a stepping stone toward reform and stability, and that is what it seems has now been officially communicated to Nay Pyi Taw this week. Now, following on from the lack of advance voting in Chiang Mai last week, more embassies and consulates in foreign countries have by now opened for voting, and there have been more reports of low turnout. The embassy in South Korea's Seoul, for example, had to extend its advance voting period this week as apparently very few Myanmar nationals showed up to cast ballots, even though there are tens of thousands of migrant workers in Seoul, and regime authorities there have been forcing people who are applying for passport renewals or doing other business at the embassy, forcing them to fill out forms for advance voting. And for people coming into Myanmar, for foreigners entering the country in the weeks preceding the elections, the military regime has announced that it will closely scrutinise these foreign arrivals coming through the airports. The regime's Minister of Immigration and Population, Myint Jain, on Sunday apparently said while visiting Yangon Airport that apart from China and Russia, people from other countries could arrive and spread misinformation about the elections, at least according to an airport worker who spoke to Democratic Voice of Burma. In October, the military's Union Election Commission announced that it would, quote, allow domestic and foreign media to cover the election in accordance with existing laws, but that it would scrutinise the eligible outlets and individuals. It's really unclear just how many international media outlets will try to officially cover the election from inside the country, but there's probably going to be small contingents accompanying the election observers from Russia and China at least. And on the Frontier website this week, several acts of protest against these planned elections have occurred recently, with posters going up in cities, public broadcasts of anti-military messages. In the latest Frontier feature, you can read more about how the regime is continuing to ruthlessly pursue those who oppose its rule and elections, detaining and handing long jail sentences to a wide variety of people from film stars to ordinary citizens. Check it out online. Now, let's talk economics. The World Bank released a report on Monday forecasting Myanmar's gross domestic product would grow by 3% during the 2026-2027 fiscal year, but also saying that inflation would likely remain high at 20% in the near term. The World Bank also said that GDP would contract by 2% during the current fiscal year, which is actually an upward revision from a previous estimate of negative 2.5%. The United Nations Development Program said earlier this year in January that Myanmar's GDP had contracted by at least 9% between 2020 and last year. But what else can we know about Myanmar's national economy, and in particular how it may be affected in the future by things like these upcoming elections? Well, we're going to ask Jared Bissinger that today. He's a visiting fellow at the Myanmar Studies Program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, and also research lead at Catalyst Economics. Jared was last on the program 7 months ago when he launched a report with ISEAS on the economic governance of non-state authorities in Myanmar. But I wanted to hear from Jared today about what he thinks the national economy will be like running into 2026. Jared's latest publication is titled How China Outmaneuvers the West in Myanmar, and it was published on Monday in Fulcrum, linked to in the show notes. Hello, Jared. Welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar.
Hi, thanks for having me again. Good to see you.
Okay, right into it. Could you bring us up to speed, Jared? We're on the cusp of 5 years since Senior General Min Aung Hlaing launched his military coup and deposed the elected government. The economy since then has largely been shaped by a corrupt and repressive military regime. So what, in your expert view, is its overall health at the moment, and what's holding it back?
Yeah, well, if we look at the big picture across the last 5 years, obviously, Myanmar's economy has not performed well at all. Pretty much every measure that you would look at, which would point to that poor performance. Perhaps most importantly, you can look at the number of people who are in poverty now versus the number of people who are in poverty before the coup and before COVID. Poverty has basically doubled. And that is dramatic given, you had a country with somewheres around 25% of the population that was poor before COVID and the coup. And now you're looking at poverty that's double that, plus a significant number of people who are near poor. So, we generally think of that as being above the poverty line, but not too far above, up to maybe 1.5 times the poverty line. And that's another 25% of the population. So you're looking at 75% of the population that are poor or near poor. That's a rough estimate. You also have a huge number of IDPs. You have what's likely millions of Myanmar people who have migrated to other countries, a significant number of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. The 2026 humanitarian response plan for Myanmar, just some of the initial numbers were released yesterday, and that showed about 16 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, which is close to a third of the country's population. You've seen GDP flat. You've seen prices basically triple. You've seen massive exchange rate movements. You've seen a lot of businesses divest from the country. So it's been a pretty negative 5 years. That said, it hasn't been a linear slope. You've had events that have happened. You've had some particularly bad times. You've also had some times where things sort of stabilized. You saw that in sort of 2023. I think for the first part of the year, things looked relatively stable. You've also seen that more recently. In the last 6-8 months, I think you've seen a pretty good degree of stabilization. It's tough to point a finger at any one thing and say that's the cause, but you have seen some better indicators coming out. So I mentioned the 16 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. That's actually down from 22 million. Earlier this year, the 2025 estimate was 22 million. So, some improvement there. You've seen inflation go down somewhat. Now, it's still high. It's still 20-ish% per year, but that's come down from 35% in April. Big part of that is food prices. You've seen a big drop in rice prices internationally, which means rice prices in Myanmar have stayed pretty flat. That's great if you're buying rice. That's not so great if you're a rice farmer and you rely on that money for your income. So, we sort of see things where, you have a particular period of time when one group does better, maybe people in export-oriented manufacturing, and then you see another period of time where maybe farmers are doing better. I can't really point to a period where I can say everybody seemed to be doing better. But certainly in the last, say, 6 months or so, you've seen, I think, a degree of stabilization. That said, I think that's a very vulnerable thing. I don't know how durable that is, and I can't even tell you what all the exact drivers of it are.
Thanks. That's an honest and a good, picture summary. So thinking about what you term as stabilization in 2025, could some of that stabilization and economic activity be related to the aid and reconstruction following the massive Sagaing earthquake on March 28?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly been, some rebuilding, some recovery. It's not like every person who had something destroyed in the earthquake will rebuild. But yeah, there's certainly been a bump in activity and construction activity compared to the norm since the earthquake. That's a very common thing after natural disasters. You have that rebuilding phase. I think yet to be seen exactly what percentage of capacity gets restored. But yeah, that has certainly led to an uptick in economic activity since the quake as people seek to recover.
So economies are shaped by so many factors, right? But in your view, now we've got this big picture, how much of the problems in the Myanmar national economy are the product of particular policies of this military regime? Or would you say, is it more a case of the regime being incapable of dealing with the consequences of their violent military coup? Their failure to react well to the boycotts, the sanctions, and the natural disasters.
Well, it's both at the end of the day. There's this constant back and forth, right? So, one of the things you saw really early after the coup was people lining up at banks. They know the history of banking in Myanmar. They understand the risks, the instability. They remember a banking crisis back in 2003. And, people don't exactly trust the military being in control of the financial system and the currency. And of course, that was something the military had to respond to. So you have this public action, these bank runs, and then military responds to this by limiting withdrawals, etc. And so it's that constant back and forth, that interplay between those that I think really shapes what happens. A lot of people do things to try to avoid military controls, to try to avoid being in banks. They'll go buy gold, they'll go buy property, they'll do all these things to sort of work around the system that the SAC controls, the financial system the SAC controls, as a way to kind of mitigate the negative effects of that. People buy gold because it doesn't go down in value like the chat does. That said, the military has adopted a number of policies that are significant in their effect. Just, I think, to me, the most important ones are in trade, around the licensing and restrictions, in the financial sector, around the capital controls, the forex surrender requirements, the multiple exchange rates. These are really important policies. They shape the price of money. So, that we can't really talk about the price of an import unless you talk about the price of the foreign currency used to buy it. And that has a systemic effect. So these are pretty important policies. And they also affect the willingness of foreign investors to come to Myanmar, the ability of businesses to trade, a lot of other things. If you're a foreign investor, why would you bring money to Myanmar and make an investment when there are capital controls in place that keep you from freely taking that money back or freely taking profits out of the country to repay your initial investment? That's a pretty big disincentive. That's a big factor that's reducing new investment now, because there's no guarantee you can get your money out of the country if you do make any.
Okay, I want to pick up again on trade and investment, but if we go back to the sort of uneven nature of the economy that you pointed to earlier, could you say, who are the winners and the losers at the moment? We know that half the country's population is in poverty. People's lives are really difficult. The economy is awful from that point of view. But still, there are some sectors that are doing comparatively well, right? Which are those? And are there new vested interests being created outside the sort of standard military corruption, like in specific industries?
Yeah, you certainly have groups that are doing well. And I think it's really important to point out that this isn't just because you have a relationship with the military. It's not like it's just the cronies who are doing okay. You also have people who work in particular sectors that, you have more demand for now. People need these things more. Construction is a good one. Real estate's a good one. People are putting more money into real estate now, and so that's helped the construction sector. It doesn't mean that every construction business or real estate agent is a crony. It means that, people are looking to put more money into this sector. They see it as safer than being in the bank. And so that's helped it. Food processors are another example. There are less imported food products coming to Myanmar. And so that means it's easier for the local guys. They don't have to compete with those imports. They're able to sell more, they're able to produce more, etc. So, you see some groups like that are, they're doing okay, often just through changes in policies or circumstances or demand that have helped them. But then you see, I think broad-based, I think the experience is negative, especially among laborers, workers. Your wages in manufacturing sectors, in purchasing power terms, so in real terms, that's down, and often pretty considerably. It's tough to really get a good estimate on exactly what pay looks like. Hasn't been an updated labor force survey in quite some time. But, it looks like wages in these sectors are down double digits, and have been for a while. Farm incomes are down. You see higher levels of indebtedness. You see a lot of the hallmarks of stress on a lot of workers, a lot of, farmers, entrepreneurs, these types of things. And so, those point to kind of the broad-based challenges. And so certainly, it does create some vested interests. I will say that, on the whole, I think the business community's largely been hurt by the way the SAC/SSPC has run Myanmar. That hasn't benefited a lot of people. And so maybe that would reduce the sort of the willingness of vested interests to stick up for the current system, especially after you sort of had 10 years where Myanmar's economy really grew. But look, you still have vested interests.
Okay, yep. There's Definitely stuff to think about there. Thanks. Now, going back to trade. Since the coup, Myanmar's land borders with neighbouring countries have been periodically closed by those neighbouring countries, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, and that's been done for political reasons and safety reasons. But it's hard to know just how big of an effect this has had. What do you know about that, the trade big picture on the national economy, that is?
Yeah. So two things. First of all, it's very difficult to get a sense of what's happening with trade in Myanmar now because Myanmar's trade data, the data coming from the SAC/SSPC, doesn't use market exchange rates. It doesn't necessarily use the exchange rate that the importer pays when they're doing the customs valuations. So you don't actually know if the price going on paper matches the price of the thing being imported. And often the price on paper is an undervaluation. So, it could be $8 on paper, $10 in real life. But you add that up across the entire economy, that's a big effect. So you have that, which makes it really tough to sort of understand what's going on. But, actually from the data that I've seen, trade actually hit an all-time high in 2022 if you look at trading partner data. So add up all the countries Myanmar traded with. What does their data say? It said in 2022, Myanmar hit an all-time high. Now, since then, it has declined and declined pretty significantly. Obviously, imports are down. That is a purposeful policy of the military to constrain imports. But you've also seen a decline in exports as well. You've seen a number of policies which make trade more difficult, licensing, export first policy, these types of things. Yeah, it's certainly been affected like many other parts of the economy. Not sure, what the prospects are for a rebound. It doesn't, necessarily look great. Though again, you have some parts that are doing okay.
Thanks, Jared. So that covers some of where we're at now. Now, we've covered on this program how problematic these upcoming elections are going to be. But following the elections, what do you think is likely or possible for a, potentially reshuffled, rebranded military regime? I mean, in terms of effects on the economy. One example, if the elections do result in more countries recognising the regime as representing Myanmar, an increase in legitimacy, could that drive changes to investment?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that will shape what happens to the economy post-election. Certainly legitimacy is one of those, but, that's not the only thing that businesses make decisions on, that investors make decisions on. There's a lot more to it than that. There's a bunch of forms of risk that people have to take into consideration. And then there's the challenges of operating in the current economic environment in Myanmar. I'd say, generally speaking, I'd expect to see some type of boost after the election, some type of economic boost. I think it'll probably be limited. But, if you look at, some of the things that could drive that, I think, number one, you're just going to have clarity about the configuration of power and decision making. You know who the people are going to be, who are going to be this minister and that minister and in charge of this, and who you need to speak to get this done. So you're going to have some of that. You're going to have a better sense of what the next 5 years will look like and who's making decisions and who you need to talk to. You'll see, increased support from some countries that accept the election, probably an increased willingness of businesses from those countries to consider investment, etc. You probably see an uptick in certain types of investment. There's some things that still work okay, like the garment sector, because it works on the cut, make, pack system, where businesses can bring in the raw materials and then send out the finished goods without having to go through the same import-export process as other businesses. That makes it much easier, and that kind of helps that sector to work. And I think you could see a bump there, and some new businesses coming in after the quote-unquote election. You might also see, investments in state-linked contracts. So what I mean by that is things like the power sector, where you need a contract with the ministry who will purchase the power from your power plant. You might see a bump in those areas. You might see a bump in government-to-government stuff, natural resource stuff. So you have some areas where I think you could see increases here in the near future. I don't think the election will fundamentally transform the economy. I don't think you're going to see this rush of foreign investment. I don't think you're going to see it in competitive sectors, in sectors where you need kind of long-term stability, where you have a long period of time that it's going to take to repay that initial investment. I don't think those things are very likely. And I think, if you look at a lot of the rules and regulations and just the overall business environment, it's still pretty challenging. And that's going to be a pretty big constraint moving forward on what happens with the economy.
All right, let's keep on with investment here. The military has really increased its cooperation and reliance on China, especially since the coup, but also Russia and Belarus. And this has included signing a lot of new deals for all kinds of things. Are any of these deals significant enough to pay attention to in the coming years after an election? It's hard to get a sense when you hear from these regime media outlets about these investments and pledges. It's hard to tell just how impactful they would be if they were even possible, if they're even going to happen at all. So, yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, well, look, we have to separate China from Russia, Belarus. They're very different. Russia, Belarus, neither of these countries have ever been major investors in Myanmar or in Southeast Asia in general. Yes, there have been increased discussions, but there just aren't a lot of complementarities between these countries in terms of trade. You get garments from Myanmar going to Russia. You get oil from Russia coming to Myanmar. Those are the big things. Outside of that, you just don't have nearly as much in terms of sort of natural trade. Obviously, you have some arms and some other stuff, which is not for economic purposes, clearly. But you don't have a lot of investment. Is it possible that some of these things come through? Yeah. But overall investment is down dramatically. Investment approvals, at least, are down dramatically. And investment approvals from Russia and Belarus are very, very limited. So it doesn't really paint a picture of, a impending boom in investment from these countries. China's much different. China has much sort of deeper economic links with Myanmar. And these economic links, it's not just Beijing to Nay Pyi Taw. You just have a huge Chinese business community that works in Myanmar. The garment sector, for example, has a significant number of Chinese factories. Before COVID, the sector was just under 50% Chinese factories. Now the sector is over 60% Chinese factories. So you've seen an increase. You've seen a growing number of Chinese factories, while other countries, Japan, Korea, Myanmar factories, those numbers are going down. So you certainly see a lot of Chinese influence there. You see, discussions around expediting the railway, studies on the Jiaopu SEZ and deep sea port. So you do see some discussions on these things. You don't really see a lot of money flowing, construction, those types of things. It's not really happening to a significant degree. That might change. I think that's certainly possible. And then you see just informal Chinese investment in Shan State and Karenni and all these places. And then, of course, things like rare earths, et cetera. I wouldn't necessarily think about that as investment. That's really extraction. But you have a lot of that as well.
All right. Now, before we finish, let's gaze a little bit deeper into the crystal ball, if you'll indulge me. What about just small tweaks rather than big policy? Have you seen any hints of any smaller practical sort of changes affecting the economy that could come following the election? Are there any questions or conditions that may encourage them?
Myanmar's economic policy challenges are not technical, they're political. The reason that they have adopted so many of these policies is political. They need them to stay in power. They need them to control actors in the economy and the country, etc. It's not some kind of technical problem that they can't figure out. They used to have, when they took over through the coup in 2021, they had a market-based exchange rate mechanism. They got rid of it. So it's tough to say, oh, the issue is technical, that's why they can't go to a market-based exchange rate mechanism. No, they got rid of it. So what kind of political space is created after the election to reform economic policies? That's a good question. I couldn't tell you. I think there will probably be some changes, but at least in the first, say, 12 months after the election, my guess would be those changes are, they're kind of marginal. They're doing things around the edges, but they're not really changing some of these core policies that need to be changed. So I think a week or two ago, Mint Online noted that they would reduce the percentage of foreign currency that had to be converted at the official rate from 25% to some lower number. And okay, that's going to help some businesses, etc. But you're not fundamentally changing the system. You're kind of just you're working around the margins. I think one of the things that could really affect businesses is the degree of stability after the election. Look, you talk about the election not being free and fair. It's not going to return Myanmar to democracy. That's a different question from does it bring a greater degree of stability for economic activity? And it might, very well might do that. And so to the degree that happens, that might make it easier for businesses. It might make logistics easier. It might make hiring easier. There's a lot of ways in which that stability will really help economic activity. So to me, that's a pretty big question. What does that look like? What does that stability look like after the election? And how do businesses respond to that? Again, I think things will probably pick up a bit, but I'd be surprised if you saw really a major change.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit since I've got you here, Jared. Nearly every week this year, there's been news related to the burgeoning scam industry in Myanmar. These scam compounds with willing and indentured workers targeting foreigners, generating huge profits, and they have links to militias and through those to the Myanmar military. Analysts often assert that link, but it's hard to judge exactly where and how the military has been benefiting from the scammers directly. And of course, the military has been trying to show that it's destroying buildings, cracking down on the scam industry this year. What do you know about the economic ties between scammers and the Myanmar military?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me start by saying, that I don't have any inside information on, where the money goes or to who. I think you can point to a few kind of macro things that might give some insights. First, look, a lot of the money from scam centers, it's in crypto. And so while the scam center may physically be in Myanmar, that doesn't mean the money necessarily enters Myanmar's economy in any way. Now, obviously, okay, some part of that will get converted into local currency to pay expenses and rents and all these things, including payments to actors such as the BGFs and whoever they hand off money to, etc. So there definitely are local connections, but it doesn't mean that 100% of that money is going to enter the local economy. One of the things I do think is interesting is that you've seen over the last 9 months to a year some different patterns in foreign exchange. You've seen an appreciation of the Myanmar Jat for the first time in quite a few years. Now, you don't want to sort of overstate what that might mean, given that you're not operating in a free market environment, but that in different contexts would indicate a greater availability of foreign exchange. Could indicate the same thing in Myanmar. That wouldn't be a surprise. Where that foreign exchange has come from, I think, is a very good question. I think there's some evidence out there that there is more foreign exchange around Myanmar more recently. And it's not entirely clear why or where that came from, or if that's sustainable. So, you certainly do have some questions there. Look, that said, I can't directly connect anything to, senior generals or anything like that. But you do sort of have a couple economic touch points that suggest that, there might be connections. But that's where I'd leave it.
Thank you for your patience, Jared, with all these questions. This one's more of a broad one that I'd give to, lots of analysts. It's about the future. We may not know what will come at the regime level following the elections, but what will you be paying close attention to? What could signal potential change, consequential change in economic policy? And what could hopefully lead to a turning around in the poverty rate and these other crucial indicators? What will you be watching?
Well, look, to me, the important stuff on the economy is, are we getting rid of or rolling back some of these economic policies that have been reduced in the last 4 or 5 years that are really huge constraints on economic activity? That's a fundamental sign of change. It's what you saw in 2012 when the USDP liberalized the multiple exchange rate regime. that was a really important thing, and that was a major sign of reform. They liberalized trade licenses. They did a number of other things, and I would see those steps under a new regime as very positive. Will you see things like new investment in infrastructure, in power production? Yeah, I think you will see that. I don't think that's as good of an indicator about a fundamental shift in the regime. They might tell you they have more money or they're changing their priorities about things, but there's very different implications of those types of policies. And then, another thing that I think is important is just sort of the degree to which there are checks and balances on the power of state institutions and the military in the future. If you see more of those, I think that'll have a really positive impact on the economy. It'll give people a little bit more confidence. Most people don't have a lot of confidence in safety and security of their investment in Myanmar now, and it just means people invest less, do less, et cetera. And that's macro level, but that's also, farmers who put less fertilizer on crops when they're not sure what the price is going to be in 4 months. So that has effects across the economy.
Okay, and for people who liked hearing from you and want to hear more from you, Jared, what are you working on now? I can see that you're on a panel next week for the ISEAS Institute about the elections, 9 a.m. Thailand time on Wednesday. Anyone can register for that. What else is happening?
Yeah, so we have a panel coming up next week where we're talking about, at least I'll talk about sort of some of the potential economic implications of the election. Actually just got done writing a piece for ISEAS looking at kind of views on the election and potential post-election trajectories, pretty similar to what we've talked about today. Also doing some work on humanitarian assistance and cash assistance and trying to kind of look at what are the different drivers of need. You certainly see conflict-related drivers in many parts of Myanmar, Rakhine State, Karenni, Karen. But then, the figures from the 2025 Humanitarian Needs Response Plan showed that there were 2.3 million people in need in Yangon. So what does that tell us? It means that probably the driver of that need is linked to economic policy and the poor state of the economy. So we have a humanitarian situation that's different in different parts of the country. And I think that requires people to think differently about them. Obviously, the humanitarian response is focused primarily on conflict-affected areas, internally displaced people, those types of things. But there is need elsewhere. And I think it points to, kind of the multifaceted nature of the problems in Myanmar.
All right. Great to have a heads up on those. Thank you again, Jared, for joining the show. As Myanmar enters another really important year, we hope to see some turnaround and improvements in the quality of life for people suffering under this regime. Thanks for joining the show.
Great. Thank you.
And a big thank you to everybody listening all the way to the end of this show. Remember, you can email us at whimyanmar@proton.me, and be assured that we love receiving your emails and corresponding with you. Also, be sure to check out the latest episode of our sister podcast, Do Atan, which focuses on human rights. It's available on all the apps, and this week's episode features teachers and residents of Yangon giving their opinions on the upcoming military elections. Now, until next week, farewell and do take care.